You might not expect that a moonlit footpath on a limestone ridge could lull you to sleep, yet here we are, drifting up the gentle back of a Sabica hill, where the palaces of Granada once balanced. Like slow thoughts on a pillow, there's no hurry. The stones remember every slippered footfall from 6 centuries ago and will remember yours, even if you only visit in your imagination. Propped on that extra cushion you promised yourself last week, a single owl peers down, pretending to be the chief usher of the night shift, and somewhere a bureaucrat's ink blot from 1377 still complains about an over-ordered shipment of silk tassels. If you're somehow awake long enough to notice, you could subscribe to this sleepy ramble, though the owl assures me statistics are overrated at this altitude. The breeze sifts through fragrant pines, and because history never perfectly trims, its edges carries a whiff of roast lamb left from a forgotten feast, the kind of banquet where a sultan's cousin once argued that raisins were politically subversive. Every few steps, a carved verse appears, praising both God and the architect's neat handwriting. The letters shine even when no torch is lit, as though moonbeams have unionized and taken up subtle calligraphy. Scholars later measured those lines and discovered that the wall segments align with the golden ratio almost by accident, like someone folding a bedsheet and inventing geometry before bedtime. The royal stride was slow, almost choreographed, each sandal tapping a code that palace guards pretended to understand. A tiny door, still small enough to make any conqueror stoop, opens with the soft sigh of cedar, and the darkness inside is neither cold nor warm, but politely undecided. If you lean closer, you can hear last night's gossip about a ruby clasp that slipped from a princess's sleeve and landed, with perfect comedic timing, in the vizier's soup. No one dared retrieve it, so the ruby is presumably still trying to dissolve. The path keeps climbing, then leveling, then climbing again, a sleepy heartbeat disguised as urban planning, until you reach a terrace where the city lights of medieval lanterns should be, but the only glow is the moonlight resting on whitewashed ramparts like spilled milk, refusing to dry. Somewhere beyond that terrace, the water begins its patient monologue, and you naturally follow, because water persuades better than any royal decree. The Court of Lions waits, not roaring but purring, its marble pulsing with the small burr of hidden aqueducts. 12 stone lions hold the basin aloft, each face, mildly confused about the long shift, yet none admitting the need for a break. A steward in 1391 described the fountain as a perpetual sermon on modesty, delivered by plumbing, which historians cite mainly so they can footnote the first recorded joke about indoor irrigation. The water murmurs facts that never made it into textbooks. It reminds us that the channel carved under the eastern arcade is precisely as wide as a 13th century sandal, meaning the architect either loved symmetry or hated wet feet. Every droplet travels from the distant Darrow River, uphill by clever siphon, just to perform the smallest splash you have ever failed to notice. In the cool hush, you may smell wet stone, distant citrus, and the faint memory of parchment softened. With rosewater, a medieval hack to keep manuscripts supple, not unlike moisturizing a smartphone if that were less advisable. Moorish mathematicians once timed the fountain's heartbeat, discovering that in one full lunar cycle the basin empties and refills exactly 144 times, a number suspiciously close to both a perfect square and the amount of patience needed to copy the Quran by hand. Over 100 archways encircle you, repeating lace-like stucco that teaches pattern recognition better than any sleepy puzzle ad. Above, wooden galleries creak in such slow motion that they sound like dreams adjusting their pillows. Somewhere, a cat, a direct descendant of Palace Mausers, chooses a balustrade and rehearses its silent aria to the night. You wonder briefly whether anyone ever tried fishing coins from this pool the way tourists prod fountains today. A scribe notes one fine for unauthorized immersion of ankle, suggesting at least one bold splash. The water keeps talking, low and steady, until you stop trying to decipher words and just follow the rhythm that arrives, expands, jokes about a misplaced sandal, then dissolves back into whispering stone. When midnight drapes the lattice screens in velvet shadow, a lantern glows inside the women's quarters, and the faint perfume of jasmine wanders out like a troubadour too shy to sing. Storytellers once earned their bread here by whispering tales designed not to excite but to settle the mind. Perfect practice for an insomnia channel centuries ahead. Of schedule, one favorite yarn involved a court poet who composed odes so tranquil that listeners occasionally forgot to applaud, mistaking his grand finale for an intermission. He claimed this was intentional, a triumph of serene narrative. The harem corridors were laced with cedar panels drilled to release fragrance whenever a door slid shut, a clever system later defeated by a curious goat that chewed through 3 panels before realizing they tasted like graphic design. Above stalactite stucco, the famous muqarnas looks like frosting left out overnight. And yes, a bored kitchen attendant once compared the two, sparking the first documented dessert. Metaphor and Andalusian architectural criticism. The night air collects all these accidental footnotes and rocks them gently, as though the building itself were tucking its own anecdotes into bed. Somewhere within the soft hush, a young sultana secretly calculates the number of courtyard tiles per loom day, finding the result deeply relaxing. Modern economists might call this an early form of spreadsheet meditation. A eunuch stationed by an ivory doorway counts heartbeats instead of hours, because the hourglass kept him awake with its sandy hiss. Outside, jasmine vines climb over lattice, like polite trespassers, releasing scent notes that scientists now know include trace molecules identical to those in human sleep pheromones, although the vines themselves remain blissfully unaware of their therapeutic resume. An astronomer in a windowed niche marks each passing star, not for navigation, but for the soothing certainty that orbits continue whether or not the palace ledger balances. He once misplaced Mars for 3 nights running, wrote an apologetic poem to it, and still received a raise for improving morale. Guitars hush, drums nap, and someone faintly hums a tune that will never get stuck in your head because it is composed entirely of rests. The air pauses, expands into soft anecdote, cracks one quiet joke about a runaway goat, then folds back into the jasmine haze. Just before dawn announces itself, the gold inlaid ceilings of the Hall of the Two Sisters catch the earliest, almost indecisive light. For a moment, the patterns overhead are nothing but soft mathematical murmurs, the polygons arranging and rearranging like half-remembered dreams flickering on a closed eyelid. An Adahan begins somewhere beyond the walls, so gentle it resembles the world exhaling rather than a human voice. Listeners have been known to fall asleep again before the final syllable completes its arc. The call drifts through cedar lattice, wakes a single sparrow that instantly forgets to chirp, and nudges the palace geometry to glow fractionally warmer, as though the ceiling itself has agreed to brew tea in your honor. Historians later discovered that one coffered dome here contains exactly 8,017 individual cedar pieces, one shy of the year's total number of hours, leading to a brief academic spat over whether the artisans were making a joke about missing time or simply eyeballing. A carpenter's margin note reads, "If any part creaks before the next dynasty, please notify maintenance," which suggests both confidence and a sublime misunderstanding of political turnover. Light creeps across tiled walls where cobalt meets copper and tiny mosaics rivaling any pixel art. If pixels were sprinkled by hand and occasionally interrupted by a pigeon footprint, the silence is thick enough to support its own weight. You could lean a question against it, and the question would topple over, too relaxed to stand. Somewhere down a quiet hallway, A clerk slowly unrolls a scroll detailing the palace soap inventory, and we discover there was once a shortage caused by a flash flood of gift baskets from a diplomatic envoy who confused quantity with sincerity. Even that bureaucratic mishap feels soothing now, like realizing your alarm clock is set for a day you have already lived. The ceiling's gilded ribs reflect the growing amber, each facet passing the light to its neighbor with the courtesy of a librarian shelving smiles. You may notice in one corner a tiny etched phrase, "Only the restless count angels," a reminder copied by tourists long after the palace passed into quieter hands. The dawn continues to swell, not loudly, just enough to notice the dust. Moat's performing a dress rehearsal for gravity. By the time the lamps are no longer needed, they remain lit anyway, because someone forgot to extinguish them in 1492, and the tradition stuck like a gentle punchline, told once every 500. Mornings. The narration could wander on, measuring staircases by the patience of feet, cataloging faded murals that smell faintly of pomegranate rind, or tracing the echo of carpets long dissolved into silence. Yet even the ceiling seems to sigh that further. Details can wait until another night, when the stars are prepared to rehearse their slow rotations again, and you are already settling, already somewhere between the line fountain's hush and the first note of the distant call, drifting quietly, past the reach of any closing sentence. You might not expect that a half-inch discrepancy along the short edge of a pale cream envelope could stir the distant corridors of empire, yet here we are, smoothing the first sheet of brittle correspondence from 1823, its flap not quite square, its papers smelling faintly of lampblack and lime water, its very existence proof that someone long ago thought envelopes should finally agree with one another. If you manage to stay awake at least until I reach the riveting footnote about envelope gum crystallizing in damp London basements, feel absolutely free to subscribe, though the envelopes themselves assure me acknowledgements are optional in the small hours. In those early days, letter writers folded pages any way they pleased, sealing the bundle with wax and optimism, but postal clerks preferred predictability, the way cats prefer napping on precisely the document you need. So a committee met slowly, gently, often pausing for tea so weak it resembled historical transparency, and began measuring samples with ivory rulers that squeaked softly when humidity shifted. They discovered, to mild surprise, that a quarter of the kingdom had settled on a width defined by one average gentleman's thumb plus a respectable margin, while others favored the span of 2 half-crowns laid edge to edge, a system reliable only if your coins were not busy paying tolls. The committee, wary of starting a scandal, recommended neither thumb nor coin but a size called number 3, which implied the existence of numbers 1 and 2. Though no one seemed ready to describe them in public. The recommendation drifted through the halls of the General Post Office like a feather that had forgotten which bird it belonged to. Clerks in tall stools copied the new dimensions into ledgers, whose pages already groaned beneath previous standards for ink viscosity and twine tensile strength. One diligent scribe tested the rule by sliding an approved envelope beneath the office door to see if it fit. An experimental protocol charmingly known as the knock and slide, and noted with some relief that the item glided through with no audible complaint. Around this time, a pamphlet titled Uniformity in Stationery, a reassuring prospect, circulated, providing such soothing prose that readers occasionally used it as a blotter, staining the margins with orderly rectangles of blue-black ink. A single footnote proposed that envelope corners be slightly rounded to avoid spiritual injury to adjacent correspondence, a phrase so meek it put itself to sleep before anyone could debate it. Meanwhile, stationers on Fleet Street adjusted, their cutting dies by fractions of inches that felt like philosophical experiments in patience. One remarked that he now understood infinity, having spent an afternoon shaving slivers off paper, only to be told the slivers still looked impolite. Time drifted onward, and with it came a new distraction, the flap angle. Some envelopes closed, with a sharp triangular grin, others with a soft crescent like a sleepy yawn. Engineers, because the 19th century cultivated engineers as eagerly as moss cultivates. Shade devised hinged protractors to check whether the flap described a precise 45 degrees. Historians later found these devices still waiting in oak cabinets, springs relaxed as though anticipating a revival that never arrived. One afternoon, a junior clerk calculated that if every flap in the kingdom deviated by 2 degrees, the annual cumulative excess of paper would equal the weight of an adult cow. An observation filed under miscellaneous curiosities beside notes on the acoustic qualities of twine. To prevent this bovine apparition in pulp form, the committee endorsed a gentle compromise. An angle neither too steep nor too lax, described only as agreeable. Printers dutifully engraved diagrams in the Gazette, though the lines were so faint that subscribers often mistook them for stray hairs and brushed them off, thus wiping away half the nation's flap policy in a single absent-minded gesture. When railways began hustling mailbags through fog-soaked mornings, envelope sizes met iron schedules and learned humility. Station porters preferred bundles that stacked without complaint. So number 3 thrived while number 2, still undefined, receded into theoretical storage like an unobserved planet. A survey noted that envelopes taller than 5 inches tended to slump when jostled, a phenomenon described as melancholy posture. In a report, no one had the heart to abbreviate. To combat slumping, manufacturers added a ghost weight of clay to certain papers, not enough to feel, just enough to encourage backbone, and soon wrote advertisements claiming their stationery stood upright, even in adversity. A line later, borrowed by an inspirational sermon of uncertain popularity. In seaside towns, salt air curled the gummed flaps into curious spirals before they could be sealed, prompting one postmaster to recommend storing envelopes in biscuit tins alongside. Morning rusks, thereby imparting a faint butter aroma to outbound invoices. Scholars debating this practice today still disagree on whether the fragrance improved pay-on-time rates, though everyone concedes it made ledger storage. Pleasantly bakery-adjacent dot as the century matured like cheese in a temperate cellar. Decimalization of measurements crept in with polite tread, and envelope committees reconvened to translate thumbs and half-crowns into millimeters a word that required 2 committee meetings just to standardize its spelling. The new chart listed 15 official sizes, yet printers only stocked 7. Binders acknowledged 5, and village post offices requested 2, proving a fundamental law of stationery. Possibility expands faster than shelves. One retired naval officer, now a hobbyist of postal minutia, set about cutting envelopes into progressively smaller siblings until he produced something scarcely larger than a postage stamp useful only. He claimed for letters of apology too bashful to elaborate. During a mild heat wave, the glue on his prototypes fused them into a compact brick, which he displayed proudly as the densest correspondence ever rejected by the Royal Mail. Visitors admired the effort, made sympathetic noises, and quietly wondered if sleep might be contagious among envelopes too snug to breathe. Somewhere in a forgotten annex of the Post Office Museum, a wooden cabinet still guards calipers carved with letters N-O and P, hinting at envelope sizes that never achieved quorum. The calipers open and close on empty air, rehearsing measurements they will never confirm, yet seeming content in the slow rhythm of indefinite potential. Dust has annotated their hinges with a chronology of seasons, thick in spring, thin in autumn when touring school children lean in to see, then thick again as exams pass and curiosity hibernates. A curator once tried polishing the brass screw on size O's gauge, only to discover the gleam disturbed the gentle uniformity of the room. So the shine was dulled with a dab of beeswax and an apology written notably on paper, narrower than any current standard. Modern historians catalog the cabinet annually, weighing the silence, updating climate readings, and confirming that each instrument still measures exactly nothing. They record this faithfully in spreadsheets whose columns stretch rightward like sleepy avenues, each cell an empty envelope awaiting a letter that prefers not to arrive. And so the saga continues, not with triumphant breakthroughs, but with the soft persistence of paper fibers aligning under slight pressure. Somewhere today, a mailroom worker folds a compliance notice, aiming for number 3, but landing contentedly on something closer to 2 7/8. No alarms ring, no committees convene, because the world has grown tolerant of gentle deviation. The old charts linger on archive walls, their ink faded to the color of early dawn, reminding passers-by that measurements once mattered enough to justify fresh tea and 2-hour debates. The envelopes themselves, stacked in sleepy geometry, rustle now and then as though sharing courteous gossip about flap angles, corner curvatures, and the perpetual mystery of size 1. You might imagine them sighing with the quiet pride of objects that have fulfilled their destiny simply by existing in acceptable proportions. Outside, a late tram hums through streets mapped long after the first standard was drafted, its windows glowing like thumbnail sketches of envelope silhouettes, rectangles sliding through the night, making no fuss, asking no questions, bearing sleepy stories from one pillow to another, until even the most fastidious ledger entry nods off beside its ruler, and the half-defined sizes shuffle themselves gently back into alphabetical order, waiting without any particular urgency for dawn to address its next unhurried envelope. You might not expect that an entire guild once convened just to argue about the ideal diameter of a grain of sand, yet here we are, sifting through the drowsy chronicles of early modern hourglasses where time itself was persuaded to fall at the pace of a lazy snowfall. If you manage to stay conscious long enough for me to reach the thrilling debate over whether ground eggshell improved flow consistency, you're welcome to subscribe, though the sand insists you take no unnecessary action on its behalf. In the mid-16th century, Benedictine monks along the Bay of Biscay began collecting sand at dawn, believing each tide's first offering carried fewer intrusive pebbles. They wore felt-soled slippers so as not to startle the gulls, and they filled woven baskets lined with linen that smelled faintly of lavender, thanks to a prior who thought serenity transferable by scent. Those baskets were hauled, slowly, to a drying shed where heat from a charcoal brazier drifted upward like a polite question. The grains turned warm and whispered quiet, and a novice was tasked with stirring them using a goose feather at precisely 7-minute intervals, a schedule maintained until the feather molted, at which point everyone agreed the sand had achieved a philosophical dryness. Once parched, the sand met the sieve, an instrument whose mesh pattern inspired at least 2 devotional poems about order emerging from chaos, and one short satire describing mesh as excessively polite spiderwebs. Brass rings held the cloth taut. Each ring was numbered with Roman numerals that bore no mathematical relation to the aperture size, a quirk that kept apprentices humble and masters amused. A remainder pile grains too rebellious to pass through was dutifully returned to the shore with a benediction, ensuring the beach never felt entirely robbed. Those grains might reappear decades later, lodging in the cuff of a merchant's boot, whispering that not every career in measurement required fitting through squares. Meanwhile, the chosen particles advanced to a wooden tray for inspection, under the soft gloom of beeswax candles. Inspectors rolled each grain between thumb and forefinger, listening for what one treatise called the absence of complaint, a phrase so vague it could only make sense after midnight. Now and then a monk encountered a pale, translucent granule the size of a pinhead, and recorded the discovery with the quiet pride of someone cataloging snowflakes during a heat wave. From monastery to marketplace, the sand traveled in sealed jars, each cork bound with ribbon dyed the color of the abbey's patron saint, meted scarlet on feast days, contemplative gray otherwise. Merchants purchasing these jars tried not to jostle them, lest premature motion age the sand, an idea scientifically unsound, yet somehow comforting. In Antwerp, a cooperative of glassblowers received the shipments and decanted the sand into bell-shaped bulbs while discussing lunch plans that mostly revolved around cheese. The bulbs cooled on willow racks that left faint linear impressions resembling musical staves, prompting one apprentice to compose a lullaby by tapping each bulb in sequence. Historians later declared this the dullest concert Europe ever applauded. Once cooled, the bulbs were paired and fused by a thread of molten glass no thicker than a hair on a drowsy bumblebee. If the meeting seam bulged even slightly, sand would hesitate mid-journey, producing what manuals refer to as an hour of inconvenient elasticity, a phrase that sounds like a philosophical crisis but merely meant you might miss vespers. Testing took place in a timber loft above the workshop, where a row of crude wooden tables leaned forward as though curious. Hourglasses were flipped and candles were lit, and scribes noted the minute when the last grain dropped into the waiting belly. Each scribe held a quill trimmed so short it resembled a hedgehog's daydream, a precaution to prevent flamboyant flourishes that might slap adjacent testers and disturb the sand's concentration. The desired performance window was anything from 58 to 63 minutes. Anything faster suggested the sand felt too athletic, anything slower implied existential procrastination. To adjust velocity, artisans might blend in a whisper of ground marble or the aforementioned eggshell, whose calcium platelets allegedly persuaded neighboring grains to slide rather than hop. Contrary evidence suggested the eggshell merely turned, the sand a paler shade of forget me later, but commerce is generous to plausible myths. Once a batch met the calm middle of the time spectrum, a small parchment tag declaring appropriate precipitation was tied with catgut around the neck of the glass as though the device might wander off without proper credentials. Distribution. Crews loaded crates onto canal barges, stacking them in such orderly grids that onlookers mistook the cargo for transparent beehives. Moving through misty waterways at dawn, the barges seemed to carry hourglass constellations, each bulb collecting dew on the outside while resolutely refusing to leak inside. Dock workers, bored between rope coiling and biscuit chewing sometimes, flipped a glass for sport, betting whether the sand would finish before the gulls fought over crusts. Bookkeepers frowned at this pastime but kept records of winning times anyway, adding an accidental footnote to every shipment ledger. When the crates reached London cloth merchants, the glasses went straight to cutting rooms, where tailors used them to time the steeping of starch or the exact duration a bolt of wool should rest before measuring. In a diary found beneath floorboards, one tailor complained that a particularly crisp batch of sand rushed impatiently through its throat, causing a waistcoat lining to set prematurely and puff like an offended pigeon. No remedy existed beyond shrugging, trimming the excess, and noting sand in a mood. By the late 17th century, French naval officers considered hourglasses essential enough to issue a directive titled On the Provision of Granular Chronometers, a mouthful that caused several midshipmen to request leave for linguistic fatigue. Ships carried glasses of half-hour, quarter-hour, and somewhat vague duration, the latter reserved for signaling meal breaks so generous that an actual hourglass felt discourteous. Sailors learned to sense the glass's rhythm. Through deck vibrations, they could predict the last fall of sand 7 heartbeats early, a party trick sometimes rewarded with extra raisins. When humidity swelled above the tropic thresholds, Supervisors baked the glasses gently in the ship's galley oven to restore a cooperative dryness, announcing the sand is toasting, as though that made chronological sense. Despite such care, maritime records list dozens of voyages where the main hourglass cracked during storms, releasing sand that merged silently with stray rice in the pantry, and thereby enriching a generation of unintended pilas. Back on land, the 18th century coffee house. Culture embraced hourglasses as the perfect accompaniment to debates about woke tariffs or the morality of high-heeled shoes. Patrons ordered a glass alongside their drink, not to mark time strictly, but to impose a hypnotically slow metronome on conversation. Observers remarked that arguments lost their edge whenever the sand reached the waist. Opinions paused, refilled cups were poured, and someone invariably mentioned the weather in Edinburgh. One pamphlet writer extolled this phenomenon as granular civility, arguing that every city council should keep 3 hourglasses, rotating through committee chambers to encourage policies measured in polite dissents. Predictably, committees formed to investigate the suggestion, and after 17 months they agreed that hourglasses were indeed both charming and slightly dusty. Conclusions filed under action deferred until further study. The Industrial Revolution, polite though it tried to be at first, hummed louder than falling sand. Minute hands on factory clocks ticked with brassy assertiveness, rendering granular time quaint by comparison. Still, some railway conductors kept a pocket hourglass, with tinted glass blue for winter schedules, amber for summer, claiming it soothed the nerves better than whistles alone. In third-class carriages, children pressed noses to the conductor's window, hoping to glimpse the domestic hourglass traveling in circles between stations, a private cosmos turning inside the machinery of punctuality. Eventually, the standardization of mechanical chronometers relegated hourglasses to mantelpieces where Victorian mantel clocks already monopolized the concept of now. Owners neglected to flip them for weeks, then months, until the last grain formed a small Alp resting against the lower bulb, a whisper of alpine leisure that no one bothered to ski-museums today showcase these relics under display lighting. So gentle it barely persuades dust motes to rally. Curators label the sand's provenance, North Sea silica, medium sift, adding that the flow test was last verified on a rainy Tuesday when the maintenance staff lost electricity and turned to hourglasses for reassurance. Visitors lean in, watching nothing happen, and find themselves breathing slower, lulled by the notion that centuries of attention have conspired to move grains from top to bottom with deliberate calm. One placard corrects a widespread myth. Crimson sand was never ruby powder, but merely glass beads dyed with cochineal, a discovery that disappoints treasure-hungry children and mildly amuses their chaperones. Nearby, a demonstration model invites guests to rotate it, yet many decline, fearing they might disrupt a very old schedule still inching toward completion. Somewhere in a modern workshop devoted to historical replicas, artisans discuss sourcing while sipping tea that steeps exactly 4.5 minutes under supervision of their own product. They reject industrial quartz in favor of river, sand sifted through fabric once intended for choir robes. They claim the faint scent of coral beeswax improves cohesion, though no peer-reviewed study confirms this. The lead artisan keeps a personal notebook titled Chronogranular Observations, each page headed with the phrase, "Time falls, people drift," a motto as comforting as it is unnecessary. He records minor variables, barometric pressure, background music, biscuit variety, then shrugs and notes that every hourglass still reaches equilibrium. Given enough patience, his cat naps on the windowsill, ignoring both sand and pen, demonstrating a mastery of unmeasured time that humans still envy in private moments. And so the sand continues, steadily indifferent to the clocks that narrate its obsolescence. Beach tides polish new grains bound for shelves, shipping crates, or perhaps the odd bedside table where someone, maybe even you, flips a tiny globe of glass, listens to the hush of dissent, and loses track of the sentence they were reading. The grains never hurry, never complain, merely align themselves in a soft cone that refuses drama. Outside that quiet cone, the world may tick, buzz, or schedule, but inside, everything surrenders to the gravity of gentle routine. Even now, if you lean close enough, you might hear the faint sound of centuries debating grain size, each voice softer than the one before, until at last all that remains is a settling sigh and the comfortable knowledge that time, like sand, will always find its level whether anyone keeps score or not, and you can let your eyelids drift half-closed, trusting the grains to finish their journey while you slip into one of your own. You might not expect that a quarrel over whether a pencil should leave a slightly powdery or slightly shiny line could occupy 3 decades of polite correspondence between Bavarian graphite merchants and London stationers. Yet here we are, gently, sharpening our way through the quietly riveting history of pencil lead hardness grades. If you manage to stay awake long enough for me to reach the thrilling subcommittee on the letter B, feel free to subscribe, but honestly, do so only if your eyelids haven't already filed for temporary retirement. The story begins in the 1790s, when Cumberland miners extracted graphite so soft it smudged readerly fingers into accidental Rorschach tests, while Saxon quarries produced a grit so stubborn it skated across paper like a distracted ice dancer. British surveyors wanted dark, confident lines for maps. German accountants wanted delicate, erasable whispers for ledgers. French artists wanted whatever let them shade a pear without the pear filing a complaint. Early pencil makers answered by guessing. They mixed clay and graphite in ratios determined by the width of a master's thumb or the unscientific intuition of whichever apprentice had shown up early to stir the vat. Customers compared notes in coffee houses, where one bewildered clerk reported that his new pencil writes like overcooked spaghetti, a description that made sense to exactly 2 people and still launched a minor craze for softer cores. By 1822, the Faber family of Stein decided the guessing game needed gentling. They baked sample leads at different furnace temperatures, then ranked them not by numbers but by the embarrassed noises test writers made when their letters came out too faint or too bold. Paper manufacturers in Holland objected that audible. Groans were unstandardizable, leading to a summit in Nuremberg where participants received complimentary notepads, but no pencils, forcing them to borrow the very objects they were criticizing. Minutes from that meeting state, an immaculate copperplate, that the deficiency of consensus is most orderly, a phrase that sounds impressively calm until you notice the ink blot shaped like a sigh. Compromise emerged, the softest usable. Lead would be called B for black, the hardest H for hard, and the friendly middle F, allegedly for fine, though one rumor claims it honored a factory cat named Fräulein who slept on the calibration table. The scales stretched outward in single increments, 2B twice as black as B, 2H twice as hard as much like a family tree growing symmetrical antlers. Enthusiastic catalog writers compared the scale to musical octaves, though customers found no evidence that a 4H pencil hummed any higher than a 2B. Somewhere in Belgium, a schoolmaster tried to simplify matters by painting soft pencils blue and hard ones red, accidentally inventing the idea of political polling graphics, though no one thanked him at the time. The new grades traveled by river barge, each crate stamped with letters so large they seemed to shout compared to the whispers the pencils wrote. Dock workers in Rotterdam puzzled over pallets marked 9B, assuming them to be a misprint of 98 and thus extremely valuable. One foreman stored a batch in a locked room for 6 months before realizing it was merely very enthusiastic graphite. Meanwhile, Clerks in Lisbon discovered that 5H cores made excellent emergency knitting needles, albeit ones that politely erased their own stitches. These curiosities piled up in trade journals, whose editors used increasingly sleepy headlines such as "Moderate Success Observed in 3B," ledger columns, and comparative friction ratios of 6H on cotton blend receipts, articles that doubled as insomnia aids for the accounting profession. Factories refined their recipes with almost culinary affection. A supervisor at Koh-i-Noor insisted each clay graphite slurry be stirred exactly 111 times clockwise, claiming counterclockwise motion unsettled the particle's sense of community. Down the street, a rival mill swore by an 87 stroke. Figure 8, which they said lulled the mixture into cooperative slumber. Laboratory notebooks from both establishments show identical results, proving that motion, like bedtime stories, matters less than the conviction with which it's delivered. An 1870 patent for ventilated drying racks promised to impart serene rigidity to 4H leads, phrasing that later reappeared quite mysteriously in a marriage advice column dot as railroads stitched Europe into a patchwork quilt of timetables. Conductors adopted HB as the official form signing grade, praising its middle-of-the-road temperament. They kept steps in breast pockets until the lettering wore off, at which point guessing the grade became a regional parlor game. One Welsh porter bet a month's tea ration that his pencil was a 3B. Testing proved it to be a dull 2H, and the resulting forfeit inspired the first recorded instance of someone describing lead hardness as politely deceptive. Across the Atlantic, American manufacturers flirted with flowery names VelvetHist, iron quill before admitting that letters, and numbers were easier to fit on the tiny gold foil near the eraser. The erasers themselves, once little more than gummy afterthoughts, gained status when a Massachusetts chemist discovered that adding pumice made them both pinker and more self-confident. The 20th century arrived in a tailored overcoat, carrying fountain pens in one pocket and mechanical pencils in the other, yet the humble wooden pencil persisted, quietly sharpening its arguments. Art schools adopted the entire gradient, teaching students that life's mysteries could be rendered from 9H frost to 9B midnight, a philosophy summarized by one instructor as "stay within the margins but pack snacks." During wartime rationing, Britain limited pencil core darkness to save graphite for radio components. Citizens found themselves writing diaries in pale gray, as though narrating life through polite fog. An enterprising clerk mixed soot into candle wax and rubbed it over the page to darken entries, creating a smudge that archivists now study with loving resignation. By 1956, the ISO proposed an international chart mapping the European HB system to the American number 2 scale, a bureaucratic origami that folded neatly but never quite flattened. A delegate from Canada suggested labeling pencils with tiny icons of feather for soft and anvil for hard but the art was deemed too whimsical for stationary regulations that had only recently recovered from the Fräulein the Cat controversy. Instead, committees settled for printing both systems on opposite sides of the barrel, turning each pencil into a diplomatic cylinder. Children testing new supplies spun their pencils like roulette wheels, deciding homework darkness by chance, thereby inventing the concept of grayscale gambling. Teachers complained until researchers showed that no grade of pencil improved penmanship as effectively as the threat of after-class neatness exercises. Late century innovations promised dust-free erasing, scented varnishes, and triangular barrels to encourage ergonomic daydreaming. Yet graphite purity still determined character. Softer leads glided but smeared. Harder leads endured but scratched. And HB remained the reasonable cousin you invite to every stationary gathering. In 1983, a Japanese firm introduced nano clay, infusion to produce 10H leads, capable of engraving a phone number onto rice grains, not because anyone needed such precision, but because someone discovered rice was cheaper than business cards. The promotion failed to catch on, though one tiny bowl of contact information now sits in a Tokyo stationery museum, each grain still legible under a magnifying glass the size of a polite cough. Digital tablets appeared, offering simulated pencil, textures selectable with a finger tap, yet software engineers retained the familiar H and B nomenclature, proving that even in virtual realms we find comfort in centuries-old ambiguity. Users could slide a bar from ghostly 8H to inky 8B, then undo mistakes with an eraser icon that never needed replacing. Somewhere a historian of sensation noted that the human desire to watch a line darken at precisely the right resistance had survived tungsten, silicone, and Wi-Fi. The scholar wrote this observation in 4B for emphasis, then regretted the smudge and rewrote it in F, illustrating the eternal dance between excess and restraint. And so the pencils keep breathing their fate. Cedar sighs stacked in drawers, tins, and dust cups where they lean like sleepy sentinels of possibility. In meeting rooms, bored attendees still test unknown pencils on marginal doodles, assigning hardness grades by the tone of a hastily drawn spiral. At kitchen tables, crossword enthusiasts flip their pencils to chew the eraser, discovering for the 1,000th time that rubber holds no nutritional wisdom. Somewhere a notebook page waits for the decisive shade only a 2B can provide, while another hopes for the disciplined whisper of a 3H. The leads do not hurry. They merely rest at the exact compromise of clay and carbon, ready to answer whichever softness tomorrow requires. You, meanwhile, may let your thoughts drift across the gradient from sharp clarity into gentle blur, trusting that the pencils, like so many quiet witnesses, will keep marking time one silvery line at a leisurely pace, even as your own thoughts fade into a calm, almost graphite gray hush. You might not expect that the quiet, cream-colored rectangle hiding behind every library drawer once triggered a continent-spanning quarrel about whether 7.5 centimeters could ever feel as trustworthy as 3 inches. Yet here, we are sliding gently into the unhurried saga of catalog card dimensions. Should you remain awake by the time I reach the scandalous moment when someone suggested rounded corners, you may subscribe if you like, though the cards themselves would never presume to demand it. In the 1840s, Persian bibliographers began trimming scrap paper into modest slips just wide enough to record a title, an author, and a price in francs that always looked sleepier than the ink. They stored these slips in shoeboxes lined with faded silk because, as one clerk confessed, shoes and books both wander, so they understand each other. Across the channel, British librarians copied the idea but insisted on stiffer stock, claiming curl in the corners encouraged literary chaos. The resulting cards were so rigid they could double as emergency toast racks. Each institution cut to whichever measurement its paper guillotine favored that morning. So a traveler moving from Lyon to Leeds found drawers containing cards of every conceivable height, like a restless picket fence fenced only by size. Over time, drawers grew hungry and swallowed more cards, leading carpenters to standardize cabinet depths, even as the cards themselves remained delightfully inconsistent. A visiting mathematician supposedly there to research, logarithmic tables spent an afternoon measuring cards with a pocket ruler, concluding that the most common width, if averaged over 12 libraries, equaled precisely the span of his favorite cigar case. He published this discovery in a journal read by 14 people, 5 of whom promptly adopted the cigar method, while the other 9 wrote stern letters about hygiene. Soft disputes like these drifted across oceans. In Boston, a superintendent at the public library proposed 4 by 5 inches because it looks honest on the shelf, wording that persuaded nobody yet started a trend anyway. Meanwhile, Viennese archivists praised the elegance of slightly taller cards, claiming extra space for diacritical marks prevented headaches. Scholars debated whether the headache in question was physical or philosophical, decided it was both, and adjourned for Strudeldat by 1877. The American Library Association devoted an entire morning session after porridge, before polite applause to the possibility of a single blessed sighs. Attendees sipped lukewarm tea while passing around wooden prototypes resembling shallow coffins for very thin mice. The committee favored 3 by 5 inches, citing envelope compatibility and the reassuring sound it made when flicked. French. Delegates frowned, whispering that metric cards encourage modernity, while British observers worried aloud about decimals sneaking into beloved fractions. Someone recommended printing faint guidelines on each blank to tame wandering handwriting. A historian noted this would institutionalize straightness, which sounded a bit authoritarian for a medium devoted to imagination. Minutes record that a vote was scheduled postponed, then gently forgotten like a bookmark left in Chapter 9. Factories nevertheless began churning out 3 by 5 cards because machinery dislikes ambiguity. They milled the pulp longer, for smoothness, and added a whisper of clay so pencils could glide like courteous skaters. Librarians receiving the new stock found the cards pleasant to stroke, but lamented that their existing drawers were too shallow by a thumb's nail. Carpentry shops prospered, elongating drawers an eighth of an inch at a time, a process so gradual that one caretaker claimed to hear the catalog sigh with incremental relief. A Chicago clerk, famous for inventive boredom, drilled a tiny hole along the bottom center of each new card and slid a brass rod through the stack, inventing the rod and stop system that later defined card catalogs everywhere. Patrons promptly complained that the rod prevented quick removal, to which the clerk replied that knowledge obtained slowly tends to linger. His supervisor considered this profound, wrote it on a placard, and inadvertently started the first library. Giftshop.Europe answered with metric fervor. The International Institute of Bibliography in Brussels endorsed 75 by 125 millimeters, arguing the numbers sounded symmetrical in any language. Printers complied, embossing the metric legend into the bottom margin like a sleepy watermark. American tourist librarians visiting Europe purchased these metric cards as souvenirs, only to discover on return that the cards rattled inside their imperial drawers like coins inside a too large purse. One solution involved gluing a thin shim of cardstock along the edge, an exercise so fiddly it generated a subculture of catalog tinkers who held evening gatherings to exchange adhesive recipes. Honey, it turned out, left the loveliest scent, but attracted speculative bees who seemed unsure whether library silence applied to them. As the 20th century ambled forward, both sizes coexisted in mild tension, separated in global catalogs by seas and a mutual agreement not to argue. The League of Nations considered intervening, but found loftier crises to nap upon. Instead, mid-century engineers invented electric typewriters with settings for either format. A popular model stamped a subtle notch on the top right corner. Of American cards, the mechanical equivalent of a polite bow. Staff appreciated the cue until someone loaded metric stock and the typewriter bowed in the wrong neighborhood, causing a brief panic that anarchy had arrived disguised as stationery. Order was restored with a small screwdriver and an extra biscuit at tea. Gray metal cabinets soon replaced earlier oak, the steel emitting a lullaby hum whenever drawers closed. Their labels promised either A through C or 000 through 099, depending on whether your library classified wisdom alphabetically or numerically. Dust settled between cards no matter the system, prompting janitors to invent specialized catalog vacuums shaped like narrow trumpets. Manuals warned against overzealous suction, which could whisk an entire century of indexing into oblivion. With a single sneeze of reverse airflow, rumor tells of one runaway card blown beneath a radiator for 41 years before emerging crisp and suntanned. bearing the forlorn title Miscellaneous Pamphlet, possibly Swiss. It was quietly refiled, content to resume resting. Computers, of course, tiptoed in, promising infinite space without drawers or dust. Early adopters scanned cards on flatbed machines that beeped with the timidity of mice asking permission. The resulting database preserved every smudge, including coffee rings shaped like tentative moons. Yet librarians noticed patrons still, drifted to the old cabinets, enjoyed the soft percussion of index fingernails against card edges, and trusted the gentle resistance when one card refused to budge too quickly. A survey concluded that shuffling through paper offered a kind of geographical reassurance knowledge felt stored in inches rather than electrons. Vendors attempted to replicate this comfort by adding keystroke sounds to search interfaces, but electronic clacks lacked the papery aroma that made error tolerable. Today, retired drawers find second lives as spice racks and craft supply towers, each tiny handle still engraved with letters no longer obliged to alphabetize. Some drawers smell eternally of histories consulted on rainy afternoons, a scent described by one poet-librarian as cardstock and minor key. The cards themselves hibernate in archival boxes, sleeping like well-read postcards from a cousin who never left home. Archivists wake them occasionally, fluff their corners, measure humidity, and slide them back into absence. They note, with a curator's restrained joy, that metric and imperial formats have learned to nest companionably when separated by thin sheets of interleaving tissue. Proof that peaceful coexistence sometimes requires nothing more than softness. If you listen closely in a near-empty reading room, you might still hear the faint rustle of hypothetical cards, deciding whether they prefer 75 by 125 millimeters or 3 by 5 inches. Their debate is calm, like moth wings tapping glass, and likely to last until morning. You are welcome to stay until they finish, but their voices, much like their corners, have been carefully rounded by time. Instead, perhaps let your own thoughts file themselves alphabetically author, title, subject until the drawer half closes and everything inside becomes pleasantly, reassuringly still. You might not expect the shy gap between two faint blue lines to have stirred decades of patient argument, but here we are, drifting through the hushed chronicle of ruled paper spacing, where millimeters rehearse etiquette and schoolchildren unwittingly played referees. If you're somehow awake long enough for me to reach the thrilling moment when someone suggested printing the lines in a soothing shade called Whisper Gray, you're welcome to subscribe, though the paper itself would never impose such a task on sleepy fingers. In the 1790s. French stationers first dragged a comb full of indigo ink across damp sheets, leaving evenly spaced tracks that looked, to a visiting mathematician, like musical staves tired of performing. They settled on 11 millimeters between rails because that matched the width of a modest thumbnail, which in turn matched nothing at all but felt comfortingly human. Across the channel, British papermakers eyed the idea and declared 9 millimeters more economical, citing the national fondness for thrift and densely packed sermons. Clergymen applauded until they discovered their own handwriting shrank in. Sympathy, making homilies appear embarrassed by their convictions. Meanwhile, Bavarian ledger printers opted for a broad 14, claiming generous spacing discouraged fraudulent flourishes, apparently crime, like ivy, struggles to leap wide gaps. Thus began an unhurried seesaw of preferences, each new width, christened with a name that tried politely to sound decisive: royal, bourgeois, pica, foolscap wide, drawers filled with prototypes, each bundle announcing itself in penciled shorthand 8 millimeters, narrow, 10 millimeters, common, 12 millimeters, comfort-like. Guests at a party vying for the same chair. Teachers grew picky. A Prussian school inspector insisted line height must equal 1/3 the average height of the lowercase f, a ratio determined after counting 200 examples during a thunderstorm when the ink dried slower than the conversation. In Boston, a committee of educators favored exactly 8 ruling lines per vertical inch, dubbing it college because the word sounded industrious. One pamphlet promised the new spacing would inspire concise thinking and discourage flamboyant descenders. Critics noted that ambitious descenders simply coiled like contented cats within the stricter basement. Factories answered by engraving rule rollers, huge brass cylinders etched with grooves thinner than a sigh. When the cylinders spun, they hummed a low note some workers said resembled distant bees deciding on holidays. A small dial adjusted spacing fractions of a millimeter, but foremen avoided the dial after lunch because soup-heavy wrists risked imprecision. Misaligned rollers produced sheets where lines drifted toward each other, almost colliding like shy pedestrians in a narrow hall. Such stacks were sold to bargain shops under the dignified label misc, ruled, finding their way into attics where future poets mistook the random convergence as intentional and wrote odes, celebrating cosmic unity. Railways shrank travel time and expanded expectation. Publishers of exercise books wanted a universal ruling that felt familiar, whether one stood in Glasgow drizzle or Sicilian glare. 12mm spacing tested well among people with generous penmanship, but fared poorly among those still mastering the art of not touching adjacent letters. 10mm spacing, on the other hand, pleased accountants but annoyed violin teachers who needed extra vertical room for fingering diagrams. Surveys drifted in, printed on whichever ruling the respondent already loved, thus confirming their own bias with admirable efficiency. A soft revolution arrived with the steel nib, whose finer strokes tempted writers to shrink their thoughts. Stationers responded by squeezing lines to 7mm, calling it note fine, later rebranded as steno, when secretaries embraced the tidy grid for shorthand swirls that resembled seaweed dancing in a jar. Somewhere in Manchester, an apprentice misread the gauge and produced 6.5. The badge looked daringly neat, so a marketing leaflet proclaimed scientific width, arguing it matched the distance light travels in a very small fraction of a second calculations. Entirely invented but spoken with enough calm certainty to win adoption in laboratories. Meanwhile, ink chemists experimented with pigments that whispered rather than shouted. Black lines, they argued, were tyrannical, corralling creativity with jail bar sternness. Blue offered civility, but green hinted at pastoral leisure, and purple flirted with exuberance. A Danish designer proposed lines printed so pale they vanished under lamplight, giving students the illusion of blank freedom by evening. Printers loved the concept until librarians complained that marginalia drifted downhill without visible rails, producing slanted commentary that looked philosophically unsure. Compromise arrived as the aforementioned whisper gray, a shade caught between pencil memory and fog. One advertisement promised the hue felt like writing across a distant horizon, which charmed poets and bewildered engineers who required their horizons less metaphorical. During wartime rationing, governments restricted ink and pulp, forcing notebooks to embrace narrower spacing simply to stretch each sheet's utility. Soldiers wrote letters home between lines printed only 5mm apart, words marching so close they could borrow commas from the next rank. V-mail microfilming shrank these lines further, until entire paragraphs resembled tidy zippers of longing. After peace returned, school children found older stock still circulating, its cramped ruling a reminder that scarcity lingers like stubborn pencil dust. The late 20th century watched ballpoint pens skate effortlessly, leaving broader curves. A Californian entrepreneur sensed opportunity and revived wide-ruled paper, branding it Relax Line for mind map enthusiasts and generous dreamers. The same year, Japanese planners released grid 3.7 millimeters for diagrammatic precision, applauded by chess coaches and miniature origami hobbyists. Enthusiasts debated merits on early internet forums, typing earnest essays about eye strain and ascender freedom while the world's servers hummed, like distant rule rollers reborn. Digital. Tablets threatened to erase the argument, offering pinch to zoom rulings adjustable on whim. Yet programmers, respectful of nostalgia, coded presets mirroring college, wide, and scientific. Users found themselves sliding a bar until the screen matched the paper of their childhood, proving that comfort rests in the measured distance between memory and ink. Some apps even simulated slight misalignment on turn of page, a deliberate flaw to keep perfection from becoming distracting. Today, archives safeguard sample books thick with century-old rulings. Curators glide gloved fingers over pages, listening for the faint rasp that reveals spacing tighter than standard. Visitors viewing these albums whisper the odd compliment, so orderly, so patient, so unhurried. One display asks guests to guess. Widths by eye. Few manage, yet all leave certain they prefer whichever sample resembled the notebook that once carried their first hesitant story or list of grocery prices. Preference, it seems, is a lullaby sung in millimeters. If you wander a quiet stationery aisle tomorrow, you might notice how each pad breathes at its own tempo. The languid sigh of wide, the brisk inhale of college, the deliberate murmur of scientific. Pick any, the lines will wait without judgment. They only ask to keep their steady distance, guiding words the way faint moonlit ripples guide a boat that already knows the shore. And as you imagine those gentle rails stretching into a soft horizon, perhaps let your thoughts drift between them, finding ample room to settle, like slowly falling feathers choosing exactly where to rest. You might not expect that the tidy ring of holes clinging to the edge of an old postage stamp could inspire conferences, calipers, and a brief flirtation with pearl-handled punch wheels. Yet here we are, drifting unhurriedly through the measured saga of stamp perforation gauges. If you're still awake when we arrive at the notorious dispute over whether 11 1/4 perforations per 2 centimeters felt more dignified than 11 1/2. Feel wonderfully free to subscribe, though, the stamps themselves. We'll never queue at your door asking for confirmation. The story settles into view around 1840, when Britain's penny black debuted without any perforations at all, encouraging clerks to trim sheets with scissors that sighed through gum-backed paper like lazy shears through sleepy hedgerows. Corners came out uneven, envelopes sulked. Under-kirked edges, and postmasters discovered that an over-enthusiastic snip might liberate Her Majesty's chin entirely from its frame. By 1847, a Dublin inventor named Henry Archer felt the national wrist could not bear infinite scissor duty, so he tinkered with a row of steel pins, nudging them through paper to create neat fringes. His first machine punched 4 holes at a time, paused, contemplated life, then punched 4 more, producing stamps that looked politely nibbled by an indecisive mouse. Test sheets curled in humid air, each row puckering like tiny accordion pleats. Yet the mere promise of tearing without tools felt revolutionary. Soon, workshops across Europe built larger wheels whose teeth called pens, though some resembled miniature knitting needles bit into paper in continuous belts. A Persian model boasted 48 pins per segment and required 2 operators, one to feed the sheets, another to hum a steady waltz that allegedly calmed mechanical jitters. Reports suggest the melody mattered less than the consistency. If the tune wavered, the perforations wobbled as though bored. Printers measured success with an elegant little ruler named the perforation gauge, a strip of card or brass marked with concentric arcs numbered 8 through 16. You slid a stamp along the arcs until its holes aligned, then announced, with the gravity of a parish bell, perforation 12. Those two words could settle catalog prices, auction size, and entire afternoon debates in philatelic clubs, where biscuits soft patiently beside cooling tea, yet unanimity proved elusive. The British Post Office admired gauge 14 for its crisp, almost military cheer, while Australians favored 11, insisting the wider teeth suited their drier climate and more adventurous letterboxes. Canadian presses split the difference. At 12, an arithmetic compromise considered charmingly polite even by neutral observers. By 1867, a single sheet of Empire issues could display mixed gauges, the horizontal rows punched on an older machine, the vertical columns on a newer, meaning collectors decades later would squint at the same stamp and record two numbers separated by an unobtrusive X, as though the edges pursued different hobbies on weekends. One New Zealand clerk proposed printing the gauge directly onto the selvage, so future philatelists needn't measure, but his supervisor thought that felt like boasting, and the idea curled quietly back into the drawer. Manufacturers experimented with pin shapes. Conical pins slid through paper easily, but left fuzzy craters that caught on mittened fingers during winter mail sort. Cylindrical pins produced cleaner circles, yet demanded frequent honing, a task accomplished with a tiny whetstone, the size of an almond and the patience of someone counting distant sheep. A German firm tried triangular pins, claiming the resulting tier sounded pleasantly crisp, but torn corners tended to spear neighboring envelopes, so the triangles were politely retired. Meanwhile, postal chemists tweaked gum recipes, discovering that stiffer adhesives snapped rather than tore, nudging gauges downward toward broader holes that released tension like polite yawns. Somewhere in Vienna, a laboratory notebook records 67 shades of edge fray under different humidities, annotated with miniature watercolored borders, proof that even boredom can bloom artistry. Collectors, for their part, developed a gentle obsession. They carried pocket gauges fashioned from ivory, tortoiseshell, or, for the extravagantly cautious, dull silver that refused to tarnish on sweaty palm days. Meetings of the Royal Philatelic Society often opened with the soft clink of gauges unfolding, followed by the rustle of stamp albums breathing open like old accordions. A member might present a seemingly ordinary 2-penny lilac, only to reveal it measured perf 14 by 15, a hybrid so rare the room's collective heartbeat allegedly paused just long enough for the biscuits to feel ignored. Rival clubs traced lineage through preferred gauges, the 11ers in Dublin, the 13s in Antwerp, each convinced their number possessed a subtle aesthetic resonance unavailable to outsiders, much as coffee enthusiasts argue over grind size. Without ever admitting caffeine's true conspiracy, industrial progress kept nibbling. Rotary perforators arrived, cylinders wrapped with steel saws gnawing sheets in continuous motion. One American machine boasted 30,000 stamps per hour, quick enough to outrun morning gossip. Speed, however, birthed quirks. When the paper web wandered sideways by a hair's breadth, two adjacent columns merged into what catalogs call compound perforations, edges half bitten, half spared, resembling sleepy picket fences leaning into each other for support. Collectors dubbed these mistakes kisses, paying extra for evidence that even machines crave small accidents of affection. Post office accountants, less sentimental, logged them as waste, turning damaged sheets into scrap for children's. Scrapbooks where gauges mattered only if the glue stick noticed dot by 1910. The United States flirted with an experimental hyphen hole design tiny horizontal dashes instead of dots, hoping mail would tear more smoothly. Tests revealed that while tearing did improve, corner flourishes now looked as though Morse code had tried to greet the envelope and fainted mid-dash. The idea lingered for a decade before true dots reclaimed their sovereignty. Elsewhere, Sweden introduced syncopated perforations, a repeating pattern of small, large, small, reminiscent of waltz steps. Philatelists adored the asymmetry. Postal clerks cursed alignment jigs that now required counting, and the pattern quietly vanished. Amid a blizzard of size. War economies simplified everything. Pin metal was rationed. Gauges relaxed from 14 down to 11 to conserve steel, producing sturdier tabs that clung together like cautious cousins through air raid vibrations. After peace returned, factories considered reverting to finer teeth, but customers had grown fond of wide perforations that detached with a satisfying thud. Catalog editors added footnotes to explain wartime wit, creating sidebars so soporific they doubled as handy bookmarks for mid-page naps. One editor confessed the only excitement he felt all year came from confirming a rumor that Portugal briefly adopted 9 3/4, a figure so whimsical it almost seemed fictional, yet a single surviving sheet validated the tale. Framed now behind glare-free glass like a museum's private joke, the arrival of self-adhesive stamps in the 1960s threatened the authority of holes altogether. Early pail and sticks flaunted smooth edges, shocking traditionalists who compared the look to bread slices without crust. Manufacturers, sensing murmurs, added simulated perforations, shallow die cuts that suggested holes without daring to punch through. Collectors debated whether simulated counts belonged in gauge tables. One speaker argued the measurement of absence still counts as data, a notion that folded politely into evening silence when someone passed a second plate of biscuits. Even simulation required precision. Die-cut curves had to mimic historical spacing or risk visual vertigo. Thus the gauge, though now intangible, survived like the memory of footsteps on a carpet long removed. Digital age printing introduced. Photoluminescent tagging, QR codes, and textured varnish, yet the perforation gauge kept appearing in design briefs, its numbers echoing like ancestral wishes. A 2012 finished Christmas stamp wore perf 13 by 13 and a quarter purely for nostalgia, even though its self-adhesive backing cared nothing for detachability. Designers claimed the holes completed the winter sweater motif. Auditors nodded, happy that public still recognized edges as comforting zigzags rather than mere cutting paths. Meanwhile, online collectors traded high-resolution scans, powering virtual gauges that slid along pixels. Arguments persisted whether screen dots stretched when you zoomed, but most agreed debating felt as cozy as wool socks on a tile floor, which was reason enough to continue dot today. The humble perforation gauge rests on hobby desks beside tweezers and loop, a small ladder of integers inviting measurement even when none is required. Newcomers learn to exhale softly while aligning. Hold's breath can sway paper by a millimeter, altering results and summonses destiny. Stamp shows still host quiet corners where veterans recount the fabled 12 3/4 New South Wales, the elusive 15 Denmark with misaligned verticals, the Canadian compound 11x8 that looks like a picket fence. Doing calisthenics. These tales lull listeners into that gentle head nod rhythm, known only to enthusiasts who have memorized entire catalog numbers yet regularly forget where they left their glasses. If you hold a stamp now and tilt it toward lamplight, you'll see the perforations cast minute shadows like a tiny colonnade at dusk. Each hole concedes a fraction of paper, so another might separate cleanly, an architecture of absence guiding. Presence, not unlike pauses between notes that let music breathe. Let your gaze wander along those edges, counting if you wish, or simply noticing how the row never hurries. Somewhere machines still clatter, gauges still whisper integers, but here, in the quiet between the holes, time can take the evening off while you drift just beyond the margin where numbers lose importance. And all that remains is the soft assurance that every edge, sooner or later, finds the perfect place to let go. You might not expect that the delicate hollow of a teaspoon, just big enough to cradle a sleepy puddle of tea, could provoke committees. calibration charts, and one short-lived scandal involving sardine oil, yet here we are, circling the tranquil eddies of teaspoon capacity history. If you're still awake by the time we reach the moment a pharmacist tried to patent a spoon shaped like a miniature gondola, feel free to subscribe, but truly, don't tip your saucer on my account. The spoons will muddle along subscription, or no dot in the late 17th century. English households treated spoons less as measuring tools and more as gossip magnets, each bowl hand-rolled by silversmiths who judged one good sip by eye. A recipe calling for 2 teaspoons of rose water might taste like perfume in one kitchen and polite dew in another, depending on whether the hostess favored broadleaf platters or slender tulip bowls. Apothecaries grumbled first because potency matters when your draft promises relief but delivers nap time instead. They began hoarding small pewter spoons stamped with the letter, a symbol noble but unstandardized. One apprentice claimed it meant approximate, though. He spelled it optimistically. Early attempts to codify volume compared spoonfuls to walnut shells, pigeon eggs. Even the tier of a moderately sad saint unit's charming but fiercely inconsistent, especially on Tuesday's dot by 1760. The Worshipful Society of Grocers commissioned a test. Fill 10 spoons with Bristol rainwater. Pour each into the same graduated flask and watch numbers jitter like shy crickets. Volumes ranged from 2 to 5 drams, a spread wide enough to embarrass the most forgiving pudding. Their report muttered that domestic spoons are various as dreams, a finding shelved with a sigh until colonial trade complicated life by sending molasses thicker than London fog. Sugar merchants lobbied for spoons that could tame viscous syrup without over-sweetening bills of lading. They proposed a rounded bowl exactly 1 inch long, an idea welcomed until someone measured an inch on a warped yardstick and found conversation wobbling again. A fragile consensus began in 1806 when the Apothecary Journal, Pharmacopoeia Londinensis, quietly suggested a teaspoon equal to 1 fluid dram, roughly 60 minims, or enough drops to draw a mild map of the Thames on your cuff. Surgeons applauded. Bakers nodded. Grandmothers continued ignoring printed numbers in favor of the spoon that felt properly cheerful. Manufacturers, seeing opportunity, forged spoons engraved with 1G on the handle, although many engravers mistook the symbol for a Russian letter and added decorative curls just to be safe. These medicinal teaspoons sold well at chemist shops but confused diners, who wondered why dessert cutlery insisted on Latin dot across the Atlantic. American housewives measured by common spoon, heap spoon, or, alarmingly, rounding. Spoonful, a phrase so indecisive it could double as weather prediction. A Boston lecturer illustrated the problem by offering 3 cakes baked from the same recipe, each using a different household spoon. One was bland, 1 tooth, achingly sweet, and the third served as an accidental doorstop until spring. Audience members scribbled notes on scrap paper, unconsciously inventing recipe blogs a century early. The U.S. Bureau of Standards, not yet, burdened with lasers and atomic clocks, stepped in with calipers and a kettle, declaring the true teaspoon 4 1/3 drams, or exactly 1/6 of a fluid ounce, which felt both mathematical and friendly, like a librarian who hums. But silverware factories had already tooled up for 1/4 ounce bowls, favored by a popular department store catalog. So dining sets nationwide embraced quiet rebellion. Europe, meanwhile, flirted with metric serenity. French nurseries taught that 1 Couleur a café equaled 5 milliliters, a phrase children repeated like lullabies while nursery puddings thickened nearby. German engineers admired the elegance, but insisted on double-checking with graduated cylinders full of schnapps, which fortunately evaporated before anyone could disagree. For decades, spoons shipped eastward and westward, crossing borders where customs officers sometimes weighed them out of boredom, discovering none matched printed declarations, but all made. Satisfactory scoops for pocket candies. In 1898, the British Medical Association published a chart ranking teaspoons from stoutest to sleekest, assigning names that sounded like miniature racehorses: Crown, Empire, Half Swell, and the dashing narrow bull No. 3. A footnote urged households to purchase a proper medicine glass, thus retiring the teaspoon to leisure. Housewives read the advice, brewed tea, and dunked the glass in sugar to prove glassware could lounge too. Unruffled, the BM as sponsored demonstration evenings, where a chemist dripped blue dye into spoons and tipped them into flasks, while an assistant rang a small bell whenever a dram spilled astray. Attendance was fair, but reviews noted the bell rang less melodiously than hoped. The 20th century rolled in with measuring spoons sold as nesting quartets: tablespoon, teaspoon, half, and quarter. Advertisements showed them reclining like tourists beside a smiling cake, yet teaspoon evangelists remained vigilant. During World War II, British ration books recommended a daily fat allowance measured in level teaspoons, specifying a flat knife scrape, not a jaunty mound. Bakers standing in queues debated whether flattened meant horizon flat or merely polite. In some kitchens, spoons were tapped twice on the jar rim to release surplus. Elsewhere, they were pressed once against the jar wall, an action producing identical quantities but different family philosophies. Post-war, plastics introduced spoons molded with the sacred number 5 milliliters raised in tiny, confident lettering. Children used them to catapult peas. Pharmacists used them to dose strawberry penicillin. Airline catering used them briefly before realizing passengers prefer stirring rods shaped like clouds. Meanwhile, diet books multiplied, instructing readers to measure oil in exact teaspoons, but to listen to your body for chocolate, a contradiction spoons refused to comment on. In culinary schools, professors passed around battered silver spoons stamped U.S. stand, 1 TSP, encouraging pupils to memorize the feel slightly heavier at the tip, like a thought leaning forward. Apprentices practiced leveling flour with a ruler, creating powdery mesas that collapsed in applause of the digital scales, seemed ready to retire teaspoons altogether. Yet recipe writers still typed TSP, partly for brevity, partly to reassure readers that measurements can keep their shoes on while computers float overhead. Smartphone apps now let you slide a finger to convert milliliters to teaspoons, projecting a cheerful spoon icon that trembles. If you overshoot, the electronic equivalent of a grandmother's raised eyebrow. Even voice assistants have learned the phrase, slightly heaped, though they pronounce it with robotic uncertainty, as if fearing to offend powdered sugar. Collectors today hunt antique teaspoons the way some people collect lullabies, seeking variations that differ only by whispers. They polish bowls until reflections resemble quiet moons, then fill each with distilled water and weigh the droplets on jewelers' scales, recording results in notebooks lined with ruled paper, surely descended from our earlier spacing saga. Their gatherings feature calm debates about whether early Victorian silver tended to 6 or 7 milliliters, and whether the extra milliliter mattered more to laudanum than to lemon rind. Afterward, they sip weak tea and agree that precision tastes best when served mildly lukewarm. If you pick up a teaspoon now and let lamplight roam across its curve, you can almost hear centuries of kitchens and chemists negotiating under their breath. The bowl's rim waits motionless, trusting gravity to decide how high a surface tension dome you dare before the liquid slips over and forms an apologetic drip on the counter. Count that drip if you wish, somewhere someone once did, but you may find it drifts away faster than care. Better to let the spoon rest against the saucer, settling into a silence as soft as kettle steam fading into wallpaper. Between its slender handle and measured hollow lies an entire library of arguments gently resolved by usage, and in that realization your eyelids might discover their own agreeable standard, gliding closed with the quiet precision of 5 peaceful milliliters exactly. You might not expect that a thin loop of wire quietly resting beneath invoices and forgotten postcards could incite patents, poetry, and a transatlantic quarrel about the elegance of a single inner bend. Yet here we are, gliding into the unhurried. Chronicle of paperclip geometry. If you are still awake by the time we drift through the moment, a Norwegian engineer insisted the clip should resemble a sleepy fish. Feel free to subscribe, but truly, don't press if your fingers have already. Found that blissful stillness clips themselves only dream of. In the early 1860s, clerks bundled documents with bits of ribbon or brass pins that left polite yet permanent punctures, the bureaucratic equivalent of tiny regrets. A Pennsylvanian tinker named Samuel Fay crimped a length of spring steel into a rough oval, declaring it fastener for tickets, but his prototype hugged papers the way a distracted cat hugs air, sweetly, then not at all. Stationers stalked them anyway, marketing the unpredictability as liberation for timid correspondents. Across the Atlantic, London lawyers still preferred straight pens, lining them up on polished desks like patient silver minnows. One windy afternoon, a draft scattered contracts, and 6 barristers crawled about the floor retrieving clauses. Witnesses claimed that was the hour England began craving a gentler grip. When industrial wire drawing reached a comforting finesse, machines sprouted that could twist metal into identical spirals by the thousand. The most popular early design, known later as the gem, curved twice around itself, creating a gracious double oval that held paper with pressure described in one patent as firm yet courteous. British catalog writers compared the shape to spectacles gently napping, but in 1899, a Norwegian inventor, Johan Valler, filed drawings of a clip with no second inner turn, just one elongated loop tapering to a meet point. His employers at a patents office allegedly used gems and never swapped. Valler's pen was simple, honest, arguably too relaxed. When pressed, it often behaved like a hammock after a large lunch, letting sheets slip into horizontal contemplation. Yet Norwegian schoolchildren, decades later, would wear replicas on lapels as symbols of quiet resistance, proving even sleepy geometry can wake into metaphor given historical thunder. Debated which curve distributed pressure more. Fairly, one Chicago engineer produced a chart plotting grip force versus paper thickness, each data point a tiny ink dot that looked, at a distance, like snowfall over a silent prairie. Gem style showed a smooth plateau comfortable across 4 to 10 sheets, while the Norwegian dip traced a gentle hill, then ambled downward. Committee minutes noted a possible preference for emotional security, implying people trusted whichever design looked less likely to dream mid-task. At trade fairs, salesmen demonstrated by attaching clips to silk scarves and snapping their wrists. Gems clung, Norwegians fluttered. Audiences applauded either outcome as evidence that physics could entertain without raising its voice. The Chicago engineer later patented a third form nicknamed Clover, boasting 3 turns and the optimism of a puzzle piece seeking lost relatives. It held paper superbly but refused to release them without a squeak, an attitude warehouses labeled enthusiastic right up until reorders dwindled out in post offices. Clerks discovered a side talent. Clips doubled as emergency message hooks. Bent open, they became micro antennae, coaxing VelvetHist into clarity, or improvised lockpicks when someone mislaid keys to the tea tin. One Scottish postal guide quietly advised carrying 2 gems for mechanical contingencies, a phrase so polite it could only mean mischief. During World War I, trench quarters recycled ammunition wire into crude clips. Soldiers filed love letters against mud by pressure of hope alone, the loops rusting into faint orange echoes of affection. Historians later measured surviving specimens and found them nearer in spirit to Valler's design single, Yearning curves suggesting function will soften geometry until it mirrors circumstance. Factories emerged that could stamp colored vinyl over wire, promising visual coordination with filing systems. Accountants ordered blue for ledgers, green for payroll, red for unresolved mysteries. Yet sunlit windows faded pigments unevenly, spurring rumors that unsolved mysteries purposely dulled themselves to avoid detection. Clip lore multiplied. A Kansas librarian swore that gem clips, stored point down in jars, align north-south overnight, so the day's pages remember direction. Perhaps the earliest recorded instance of office feng shui. Meanwhile, German engineers rolled out the ideal, a rectangle with serrated inner wires. It gripped like determined tweezers but snagged wool coats. One public official lost an afternoon coaxing the ideal from his lapel while newspapers waited for a statement that never came. Century advertising celebrated the clip as emblems of streamlined modernity. Posters showed skyscrapers growing. From a single gem, architecture trusting metal memory. A Persian poet published scent trombones, 114-line odes to the trombone-shaped clip, though the poet freely admitted he liked the name because it sounded like music. Spilled on metal, translators struggled. In English, the clip remained mute. Yet schools taught children to build miniature chains from spare clips, each link opening and closing with a tiny sigh. Teachers considered the craft both educational and helpfully quiet. Some chains stretched so long they circled desks twice, inadvertently solving the age-old puzzle of how to keep wandering homework localized that computing departments entered the file, wiring clips into early card-reading machinery as makeshift. Retention springs. Engineers documented wire assistant number 3 in maintenance logs, never noting it came from the stationery cupboard. When personal computers arrived, virtual assistant icons appeared, one famously shaped like an anthropomorphic paperclip with eyes full of well-meaning bewilderment. Users clicked to dismiss him, echoing earlier generations sliding real clips off memos that offered more help than requested. The icon proved that even gentle stationery can inspire impatience if it talks. Out loud, self-adhesive notes threatened a brief coup in the 1980s. Why compress when you could stick? Yet notepads curled, adhesives dried, and clips continued to hum their silent hold. One research lab observed that scientists still reached for a clip when faced with more than 3 sheets, naming it threshold of clasp confidence. Manufacturers accordingly polished surfaces to a mirror shine so tactile satisfaction joined visual serenity. Eco-conscious designers tried bamboo, then starch polymers that wilted amusingly in humidity. Office workers found them biodegradable before use. Steel remained loyal, humming faintly under fluorescent lights, like a chorus of distant tuning forks waiting for pages worth singing. Modern clip factories monitor coil tension with lasers, trimming tolerances smaller than a drowsy gnat's eyelash. Boxes leave conveyors in perfect ranks, although upon opening, clips tingle instantly, recreating cosmic spontaneity inside neat cardboard. Physicists coined the phrase paper-clip chain reaction, acknowledging entropy's fondness for conferences, even at office scale. There are still aficionados who weigh individual clips, seeking rare, underformed specimens missing a half-turn, the bureaucratic equivalent of 4-leaf clovers. They mount these in glass frames, labeling them with Latin nicknames, and insist. The display calms them better than aquariums. If you lift a clip now, feel the spring relax, then tighten as you slide it over a page corner. The wire remembers its curls the way a river remembers bends, patience stored in tempered steel. Count the loops, 2 if gem, 1 if Norwegian, 3 if clover still wanders your drawer, and notice how the curves guide paper into a miniature embrace that never boasts, merely maintains. Beyond the workshop hum and patent quarrels, beyond painted vinyl and poetic trombones, Each clip waits to perform the simplest kindness, keeping thoughts from drifting apart while your mind is busy wandering elsewhere. Let that gentle pressure remind you that order can be effortless. A quiet curve holding loose edges together while the rest of the world, and perhaps your own eyelids, slides calmly toward a welcome fold where everything stays softly in place. You might not expect that the modest forest of nylon bristles yawning from the head of an ordinary toothbrush could inspire patent duels, bristle count poetry, and a very subtle panic over whether 7/8 of an inch felt cleaner than 3/4. Yet here we are, drifting gently through the quietly mint-scented chronicle of toothbrush bristle length. If you are somehow still awake by the time we glide past the heated correspondence concerning medium soft versus soft medium, feel free to subscribe, but honestly, don't tug at the cap of your bedtime toothpaste on my account. The brushes will continue their unhurried negotiations regardless. The tale begins in the late 1770s, when English wigmakers, never shy about recycling, trimmed offcuts of boar hair and tied them into little bundles that they lashed to bone handles with brass wire. These first bristles stood proud and wildly uneven, some nearly an inch, others no taller than a polite question mark. Users complained that the longer bristles tickled tonsils like exploratory grasshoppers, while the shorter ones sulked against enamel, doing almost nothing at all. Still, the notion of scrubbing rather than merely rinsing felt revolutionary. Newspapers politely suggested genteel lengths, but no two editions agreed, and the average mouth soldiered on, bristles poking like rebellious HEGEROWS. Fast forward to 1857, when an American named H.N. Wadsworth patented a brush specifying a bristle not to exceed 5/8 of 1 inch. A measurement chosen, legend says, because his pocket ruler broke at exactly that mark. Competitors countered with 6/8 for reach and 4/8 for agility, terms lifted from contemporary fencing manuals to add a whiff of dashing bravado. Apothecaries stocked all three, labeling them 3 degrees of mourning. Courage. Customers bought whichever promised fewer splinters, for boar bristles still snapped unpredictably, sometimes lodging between molars where they remained until next equinox. When celluloid handles arrived, manufacturers raced to civilize the forest. They built clattering trimming wheels, small copper, discs rimmed with razor-keen teeth that sheared bristles to uniform height. The wheels spun with a soothing burr, like distant bees dictating etiquette. Early trials settled on 1/2 inch because it produced neat silhouettes for advertisement sketches. One jaunty poster showed bristles standing in military rows under a banner reading, "We march against plaque." Yet dentists whispered that 1/2 inch left the gum line uninvited, like ignoring the rim while polishing the plate. So the wheel height ratchet was nudged downward a 1/16, then another, until standard catalogs began listing 0.44 inch, a number so oddly specific it sounded secretly scientific. Enter nylon in 1938, slick, springy, and blissfully free of barnyard aroma. Chemists at DuPont discovered that when extruded through spinnerets of calibrated diameter, each filament sprang back with cheerful consistency. They recorded bristle recovery times, how fast a strand straightened after a bend on charts that looked like heartbeat lines taken from very calm lizards. Shorter strands bounced quicker but cleaned timidly. Longer strands swept boldly but tired early, like enthusiastic toddlers. After months of sleepy testing, the lab announced that 0.467 inch provided the optimal resilience curve. Marketing rounded it to 0.47 for friendliness, though one copywriter tried 470 thou, hoping aloud that a technical wink would dazzle breakfast readers. It mostly puzzled them. World War II interrupted further fine-tuning. Nylon diverted too. Parachutes and toothbrushes reverted to whatever bristle stock survived repainting drills. Soldiers received brushes labeled simply short or long. Oral hygiene manuals advise the long version if you fear rations have lingered, though ration kitchens ensured little lingered at all. Field dentists invented a game, Guess Bristle. Length by silhouette alone. Winner got first pick of tinned peaches. Measurements scribbled on canvas tents suggest lengths drifted up to 0.53 inch during humid summers. Perhaps swelling with the collective sigh of homesick brushing, peace returned and trimming wheels whirred back to life, now guided by photoelectric sensors that blinked when a rogue bristle dared exceed tolerance. Factories boasted tolerances to 1 human hair, forgetting that human hairs themselves vary like daydreams. A Minnesota engineer solved the paradox by borrowing a lock from his own head, measuring the median strand and immortalizing it in a plexiglass frame hung above the production line. The plaque read Standard Follicle, 1951, and workers tipped imaginary hats each morning as machines clipped bristles to its honor. During the 1960s, designers grew playful, carving V-shapes, crowns, and gentle domes into the bristle topography. Domed profiles required longer outer filaments and shorter inners, resulting in lengths from 0.42 to 0.49 inch, within the same head an architectural overdose for statisticians. They drafted new charts mapping peak to valley variants, color-coding bristles as if planning alpine ski runs. A Swiss firm released the Melody, whose alternating tall-short pattern claimed to sing plaque to sleep. Reviews confirmed it hummed faintly when dragged across incisors, though the melody varied from user to user, perhaps modulated by hope. Softness codes followed, SMSM, and the mysterious SM for people afraid of commitment. Manufacturers discovered that tapering the last 0.04 inch into microfilaments created an illusion of softness, without sacrificing spine. Patent drawings filled with magnified bristles resembling marsh grasses under a microscope. One patent argued that tapered tips reduced perceived aggressiveness, a phrase later borrowed by corporate trainers teaching email etiquette. Still, bristle length remained the quiet axis around which all softness orbited. Too tall, and even angelic tips whipped toothpaste like hail. Too short, and gum sensed a regiment of blunted pencils. The 1980s saw electric handles demanding shorter bristles to survive sonic vibrations. Engineers sliced heights to 0.38 inch, printing warnings that replacement with ordinary brushes might dampen sonic bliss. Skeptics swapped anyway, reporting only an extra tickle. Meanwhile, eco-campaigners revived boar bristles, touting biodegradability, but pigs had moved on philosophically and supply languished. Laboratories countered with cornstarch filaments trimmed to an earnest 0.45 inch before shrinking 3% in hot water, a surprise that turned several travel kits into vertical terrariums of tiny curls. Today, the international standards. Organization politely suggests manual toothbrush bristles should not exceed 12 millimeters above the head, a metrification that translates to 0.472 inch, eerily close to DuPont's optimistic 0.467, proving nostalgia can masquerade as forward-thinking, yet not every nation signs on. A Japanese brand champions 9.5 millimeter precision prongs, while a Brazilian cooperative sells 13 millimeter jungle reachers. Dentists shrug and remind everyone to change brushes when bristles resemble startled palm trees. Consumers obey, though some secretly keep old brushes for cleaning tile grout. Expanding bristle history into domestic archaeology. If you examine your own toothbrush now, you may notice each filament ends in a minuscule flare, the final fraction of a millimeter, melted into a soft dome so gums feel cradled, not interrogated. Those domes, measured by laser scatter, account for almost a third of manufacturing cost, yet they disappear the moment toothpaste froth veils them like morning mist. Run a finger across the bristles, there's a whisper as if thousands of tiny grass blades sway under a breeze you alone command. That breeze has been calibrated by centuries of sleepy argument, by trimming wheels, by standard follicles framed on factory walls, by chemists, poets, soldiers, and children who once measured bristle lines against ruler. Edges out of idle doodling curiosity dots, so let the brush rest in its cup tonight. Bristles drying back to precisely the length someone once defended in a footnote. Imagine each filament recollecting its resilience curve, rehearsing the gentle spring it will offer come dawn. In that quiet rehearsal lays a promise so modest it barely stirs the air, a pledge to sweep, to polish, to guard enamel battlements, without ever revealing the innumerable decimals behind its perfect poise. Perhaps, as you drift toward sleep, your thoughts will align like those tidy nylon columns upright, forgiving, equal, and reach ready to hush the day's plaque of worries, until only mint-cool silence lingers on a breath, as measured and calm as 0.47 of an inch. Give or take the softness of dreaming. You might not expect that the quiet circle your palm meets every time you leave a room could inspire conferences, calipers, and 3 decades of wagers about whether a knob should measure more like a plump apricot or a modest tangerine. Yet here, we are turning gently through the unhurried chronicle of doorknob diameters. If you are still awake by the moment, a Viennese architect declares 47 millimeters, the sweet spot between handshake and him. Feel free to subscribe, but honestly, don't twist the latch of obligation on my account. The knobs will keep spinning their measured tailies, whether anyone rings the bell or not. It all begins, like many softly ridiculous standards, with gloves. In the winter of 1836, a London glove maker wrote to a brass foundry complaining that the knobs on his shop door flattened his best kid leather, leaving faint moons of stretched hide on each fingertip. The foundry replied that their mold borrowed from carriage hardware produced a diameter of exactly 2 inches, and they saw no reason to meddle with tradition. The glove maker retorted by mailing them a pair of ruined gloves and a bill of fare. Embarrassment. Somewhere between apology and amusement, the foundry trimmed its mold by 1/8 of an inch, surprising patrons who suddenly felt the handle nestle rather than engulf. A traveling haberdasher took note, told a locksmith in Bath, and by spring 2 subtly different sizes competed for the affection of British knuckles. Across the Atlantic, builders relied on whatever diameter paired prettily with the rosette plates they could afford. Massachusetts parlors twirled knobs scarcely larger than a walnut, while Illinois farmhouses sported ones closer to teacup saucers, claiming the extra girth spared cold, numbed fingers the indignity of fumbling livestock smells. Indoors, hardware catalogs began to group choices under lyrical headings: cottage, parlor, empire, offering little hint of dimension, except a tiny engraving of a ruler, more decorative than instructive. Carpenters therefore traveled with wooden gauges. Cut to family preference, a gauge shaped like an apple slice meant old country German taste, while a scroll-cut clover announced sturdy. Scott's thrift dot by 870 railway hotels discovered that thin-aired corridors made guests shuffle luggage with one hand and open doors with the other. Management commissioned an engineer to test knob diameters while wearing thick traveling gloves lined with rabbit fluff. His report, 12 pages of polite tedium, recommended 2 1/4 inches for certainty under fatigue. The specification reached a Paris exposition where French ironmongers, charmed by its deliberate oddness, converted the figure to 57 millimeters and proclaimed it a metric triumph, even though the rounding gifted an extra shy half millimeter. Soon export crates labeled hotel grade cross borders, each rattling with brass spheres that felt almost grand, but never quite arrogant. Domestic manufacturers, Unwilling to surrender markets, courted dentists and pianists to lend a scientific sheen. Dentists measured handspan stress, concluding that wider knobs distributed bite force from the thumb pad toward the heel of the palm important, apparently for after-supper hygiene. Pianists argued for slimmer knobs, so nimble fingers retained sensitivity for evening polonaises. A musical instrument journal published their plea beside an advertisement for metronomes, giving the impression that door entry and tempo both hinged on similar oscillations. Readers nodded, unsure why, and continued life at whichever rhythm their hallway allowed. When electricity tiptoed into homes, wiring required holes drilled behind knobs for bell buttons and early latch solenoids. Electricians discovered that a diameter under 40 millimeters left insufficient room for safe insulation, sparking tiny arcs that singed varnish like restless fireflies. Manufacturers quietly nudged molds upward to 42, calling the change modern safety and painting the boxes optimistic mint green. In Chicago, a patent clerk traced these increments on graph paper and observed a pleasing stair-step climb. He framed the doodle and later donated it to the fledgling Museum of Building Comfort, where it still hangs between exhibits on wallpaper seam widths and stair tread squeak mitigation. World War I summoned metal for sterner purposes. It's out wooden. Knobs turned from birch, hornbeam, maple gained brief popularity. Wood swelled in damp trenches of coastal climates, prompting one quartermaster to restrict diameters to no more than 1 3/4 inches less doors jam heroic shoulders. The directive trickled back to civilian draftsmen who admired its concision and copied it onto blueprints large and small. Consequently, a generation of bungalows features knobs that feel faintly sheepish, smaller than expected, as if apologizing for wartime thrift long after guns fell silent. The interwar years witnessed Art Deco's geometric flirtations. Designers sliced spheres into flattened discs, then chamfered edges into hexagons that caught hallway sound like budget gemstones. Such shapes disguised true diameter, allowing catalog writers to boast of visual breadth with ergonomic restraint. A celebrated Berlin apartment block installed alternating sizes larger on stairwell doors for drama, smaller within flats for intimacy, creating a tactile map of public versus private that tenants reported enjoying mostly at moving-in parties. Meanwhile, Swedish cooperatives proposed a national standard, 45 millimeters, chosen because it matched the diameter of the porcelain plates already glazing every light switch. Parliament debated for one polite afternoon and tabled the measure to study the question of mitten thickness during northern winters, which seemed sure to occupy several cozy sessions. Wartime rationing returned, this time consuming brass, nickel, and polite patience. Bakelite offered relief. Molders could set any diameter before tea break. Unfortunately, Bakelite chipped under rings and dog scratches, so designers built in sacrificial thickness, 50 millimeters to guarantee 48. After a season of enthusiastic door-kicking by postmen and toddlers, home front pamphlets praised the heft as a morale booster, every turn a victory, yet many households later shaved paint drips off their knobs, discovering the cheerful sphere had secretly slimmed with wear, a visual lesson in resilience. Nobody had requested. After peace, the Americans drafted building codes thick as dictionaries. Section 1608.2 quietly fixed. Odor-resistant spherical latches at 2 1/8 inches, about 54 millimeters, arguing the size balanced accessibility with cost. Canadians read the code, replaced inches with metric, and arrived at 53.9, which they politely rounded neither up nor down, but printed to 1 decimal, pioneering a standard both precise and non-committal. In Tokyo, earthquake, engineers insisted on slightly smaller knobs to reduce chance of catching backpack straps during evacuations. They settled on 44, sending tool companies scrambling to retool jigs by exactly 1 millimeter, a task machinist described. As giving a hedgehog a haircut, the 1960s introduced lever handles promising universal design. Knob loyalists gathered in small conferences titled Round Comfort is Eternal, presenting papers on subtler improvements, silicone inserts to dampen rattle, micro-ribbed brass for anti-slip grandeur, and diameters expressed in golden ratio. Multiples. An Italian artisan produced limited-run 46mm spheres in brushed bronze, claiming each completed Fibonacci's unspoken bathroom sequence. Critics mostly admired the marketing bravery. Meanwhile, hotels still preferred 58, cruise ships clung to 51, and hospitals adopted oversized 61s wrapped in vinyl that could survive hourly wipes of chlorine wistfulness. As automation tiptoed through manufacturing, laser calipers verified each blank at the speed of gossip. Statistics departments plotted bell curves of diameters, trimming outliers like gardeners snipping cloud-shaped hedges. One factory newsletter celebrated a quarterly variance reduction from plus or minus 0.4 to plus or minus 0.25 millimeters. A triumph employees toasted with lukewarm coffee. Consumers never noticed. Their palms simply felt normal. An adjective engineers list among secret metrics, after strength, after cost, but always before glory.today. International standard ISO 7009 recommends a graspable zone of 43 to 57 millimeters, phrased to sound like a rest stop on a leisurely highway. Architects choose within that zone the way travelers choose soft pillows by whim, budget, and the faint memory of doors from childhood. Smart homemakers embed fingerprint readers that require slightly wider faces. They currently favor 52, but firmware updates may yet discover philosophical reasons for 51. Somewhere a tiny certification lab still employs a technician whose sole task is to press a calibrated rubber palm against sample knobs, recording slippage and comfort on a chart shaped like a drowsy rainbow. The technician's notes read, almost every Tuesday, diameter adequate evokes calm. If you pause beside your own door tonight and let fingers rest on its sphere, you might feel the weight of centuries condensed into that measured curve. Turn slowly. Hear the latch withdraw with the sigh of metal persuaded, not forced. Know that. Boar bristles, glove makers, dentists, earthquake drills, and golden ratio dreamers have all nudged this shape, nudged again, until it arrived beneath your palm just wide enough to trust, just narrow enough to forget. Let that measured forgetting guide you toward the quiet room beyond, where the only thing needing to turn now is perhaps the gentle carousel of thoughts, settling one by one into sleep's soft clicks, each no larger nor smaller than absolutely necessary. You might not expect that the sleepy inch of daylight slipping between two wooden slats on a public bench could summon city councils, carpenters, botanists, and the occasional napping philosopher, yet here we are, easing ourselves onto the unhurried brain of park bench slat spacing. If you remain awake long enough to hear the moment a Dutch horticulturalist insists the gap should let only one chestnut pass sideways, you're welcome to subscribe, though honestly, don't trouble the pigeons by fumbling for a button. The benches will keep sighing into history whether anyone signs up or not. The first park benches of note arrived in 18th century pleasure gardens, where nobility needed somewhere to contemplate swans without crumpling brocade. These proto-seeds were simple planks balanced on brick piles, gaps determined by whichever boards refused to warp that week. Ladies in layered skirts complained of dress hems pinched between boards, so gardeners slid the planks closer, discovering, too late, that closer planks trapped rain in tidy gutters. Dampness blossomed into green moss stripes, which admirers mistook for decorative inlays until moss crept enthusiastically onto trousers. Thus began the slow dialectic of spacing, wide enough for drainage, narrow enough for dignity at debate, that would echo like distant bird calls for centuries. By 1825, the Royal Horticultural Society convened a subcommittee on seeding comfort and moisture mitigation. Minutes reveal members measuring puddles with teaspoons before declaring 7/8 of an inch the optimum slat gap for English drizzle and typical posterior modesty. Carpenters obediently planed seats to spec, yet within a season. Squirrels discovered the opening fit an acorn perfectly, turning benches into accidental winter pantries. Park attendants complained of sudden crunches beneath afternoon picnickers, while poets found metaphor in every shattered nut. The committee reconvened, shaved the gap to 3/4, and congratulated itself on outwitting rodents, unaware that smaller nuts simply queued politely instead. Across the Atlantic, American city planners faced drier climates and wilder trousers. Western towns, flush with frontier optimism, preferred broad gaps, sometimes a full 1.5 inches, so dust could sift away and Sunday suits stay presentable. One Kansas newspaper hailed the ventilating seat, promising fresh breezes. To weary cattlemen. Unfortunately, children's marbles disappeared through these generous slots, prompting paternal pocket searches and philosophical shrugs. Hardware stores began selling bench gap screens fashioned from chicken wire. Installation instructions advised, lay them gentle as pie crust. An image so homely that few minded the wiry scratch against summer legs. Industrialization brought iron frames and the possibility of mass production. Foundries stamped identical. Side supports, while slats still wooden, arrived by rail, bundled like sleepy accordions. Factory foremen preferred round numbers. Exactly 1 inch became the house standard, justified by an elegantly simple jig that trimmed spacer blocks with every third swing of the saw. Accountants applauded the efficiency. Arborists winced, observing that 1 inch gaps hastened drying in hot sun and cracked softer timbers. A compromise emerged in the form of creosote dipping, which blackened the wood and prolonged its life, but stained white dresses into zebra memories. Society columns tutted gently. The slat-spacing saga pivoted once more. The turn of the 20th century witnessed the rise of cast-iron, serpentine benches, whose scrollwork backs delighted postcard artists. Curved frames required shorter inner slats and longer outer ones, producing gaps that widened toward the ends like quiet smiles. Mathematicians visiting Paris measured these curves with tape and curiosity, publishing an essay entitled Seating. Asymptotes in Art Nouveau landscapes. Their graphs impressed exactly 7 readers, but one was a Belgian engineer who patented an adjustable bracket, allowing slats to slide and equalize spacing along any curve. Municipal budgets, however, preferred fixed screws to clever sliders, so the invention rested mostly in sketchbooks, a daydream of symmetrical repose. The Great Depression made every board count. Works progress benches in the United States adopted. 2-inch wide slats set a modest 1/2 inch apart, a thrifty marriage that used fewer planks without courting puddles. Civilians lined up for soup with backs against those benches. Discovering the narrower gaps trapped warmth like gentle ribbing. Reports surfaced of stray kittens sleeping beneath the seats, sheltered from wind yet able to peek through and evaluate. Passers-by. When funding improved, crews added 1 more slot per bench, shrinking gaps to 3/8 and creating what welders called the kitten clause, a polite nod to unintended tenants displaced by federal prosperity, or years. Diverted metal, so timber returned with patriotic urgency. In London, bomb shelters requisitioned park iron, leaving reclaimed oak beams for seating. These beams, far thicker than any leisurely plank, demanded wider spaces simply to remain liftable. One home front guideline advised a gap as broad as a serviceman's thumb and mitten, roughly 15 millimeters. Civilians, wrapped in blackout gloom, Judge the measure sound until blackout dew pulled overnight and trousers resumed their damp protests. Resourcefulness triumphed. Benches were painted with slanting stripes of linseed oil, encouraging water to spiral along grain and leap the gaps like cautious frogs. After peace, plastic entered quietly in the form of recycled bottle slats, bright as sherbet and warranting entirely new arithmetic. Plastic flexed in heat. Gaps could shrink by a millimeter at noon and widen by dusk. Engineers installed temperature gauges, charted expansions, and published tables showing ideal spacing at 25 degrees Celsius, plus or minus the whim of July. Park keepers hastily drilled drainage, holes through the slats themselves, presenting the first benches with gap within gap philosophy, tiny circles for water, longer ribbons for light, wider lanes for breezes. Critics called them polka dot seats. Children simply poked fingers through until parents traded playtime for ice cream distraction. Accessibility movements in the 1970s raised fresh questions of clothing catches and walking stick slips. Advocacy. Groups demonstrated by dropping canes through 1-inch slots and timing retrieval frustration. Their stopwatch data persuaded city councils to mandate maximum gaps of half an inch on routes designated as restorative walks. Manufacturers responded by planing more slats or switching to composite boards, molded with tongue and groove edges that left barely a hairline seam. Birds found no foothold for peanut shells. Water sheeted off like glass. But skateboarders complained the new surfaces lacked grip for casual ollies, thus comfort for some redirected recreation for others. Proving slot spacing sits at the crossroads of unexpected hobbies. Sustainability revived hardwood-like bamboo, whose narrow fibers demanded stainless steel screws set at exact angles to prevent splintering. Technical manuals recommended 5/16 of an inch between boards, justified by a complicated formula balancing swelling coefficients, vegan varnish thickness, and the poetic notion of breathing space. A Canadian park interpreted the formula generously, installing benches with almost invisible seams. Winter freeze fused the boards together in affectionate ice, and spring thaw left them forever bonded, a solid slab now technically a table. Tourists ate sandwiches there, unaware they dined on the unintended outcome of zero spacing. Digital era benches arrived with solar panels, powering discrete phone charging ports beneath the seat. Designers worried about overheating battery packs, so they revived the classic full-inch gap, this time cloaked under a perforated aluminum sheet punched with leaf patterns. Airflow danced, cables hid, and benches hummed faint wattage like sleepy cicadas. One startup touted smart spacing, sensors that detected wetness and triggered gentle seat heating, evaporating puddles before commuters arrived. The pilot program launched in a coastal town where sea spray overwhelmed sensors, convincing them it rained forever. Benches glowed year-round, comforting gulls who perched above the warmth like feathered commuters waiting for fish buses. International standards today split the difference. ISO 21489 suggests outdoor leisure seating adopt gaps no smaller than 6 millimeters. So dirt escapes broom bristles and no larger than 14. So coins rarely vanish irretrievably. Meanwhile, the European Committee for Standardization adds a footnote about scarf safety near revolvine wheels of prams, reminding us that a bench is never only a bench, but a stage for daily textiles, gadgets, paws, and crumbs. Cities print these numbers on procurement sheets, yet craftsmen still test by sliding a pencil between boards. If it clinks but does not fall, the gap is declared good company. The pencil test survives official audits simply because it charms inspectors into remembering school days. So next time you settle onto a park bench, perhaps this very evening, run your fingers along the edge and notice the precise hush between planks. Feel the breeze thread itself through, carrying leaf chatter, distant bakery aromas, or the faint static of approaching dusk. In that measured interval echoes every conversation between moss and silk, marble and acorn, mitten and cane, skateboard wheel and solar whisper. Those echoes invite your own thoughts to slip gently through, shedding the day's weight like raindrops passing the threshold from board to earth. And as the gap cradles twilight's first insect hum, you may find your mind spacing itself kindly, leaving just enough room for dream breezes to wander, exactly the width, give or take a squirrel's whisker, that centuries of benchmakers deemed politely perfect for forgetting the world a while.